My name is Susanne Vani. I'm the director of the Danish ITI, organizing the Nordic Performing Arts Days. And I'm saying this because there's some new people here, and I kind of like this fluxus that some are coming, some are leaving, and it's always a little bit new people. But I hope that some of us carry some of the discussions that we had yesterday and earlier, and also carry from. Because we actually started the Nordic Performing Arts Days in Aalborg, went to Aarhus and to Odense, and there's been a lot of wisdom in all the traveling we've been doing. And somehow it's really nice now to be able to then present Jakob Højgaard, who is the director of Nordkraft in Aalborg, who actually started the Nordic Performing Arts Days in his theater and had a workshop called New Communities. That I just heard people coming now saying that the people who came back from the workshops about them back in Sweden and Norway. So we hope we can create a lot out of this workshop. So thank you, Jakob, for doing that new communities. Now I have the chance to thank you and introduce you, and you can take it on from here.
Yes, thank you very much, Susanne. We have, as the Danish Theatre Association, we have initiated this conference today about co-creation and co-producing, and those are very, very wide concepts. But what we were interested in was that within the last 10-20 years, the way of producing has evolved extremely. The concept of the audience has changed a lot. The way we co-produce, the theatres are not institutions sole producers anymore. We co-produce with other theatres, we co-produce with other kind of cultural institutions, we co-produce with the audience, all this kind of co-creation and co-producing, we were really interested in the implications of that for the cultural institutions we represent. Maybe I should say just a few words about the Danish Theatre Association. We're an association of 66 different Danish theatres, from the smallest project-based theatres applying for the Danish Arts Council, and up to quite bigger institutions spread out all over Denmark, some of them in Copenhagen, but really all the small theatres around Denmark are associated in this organisation. So we were interested in this question: what kind of implications does this have for our work at the theatres? And this is why we have today invited Sarah Topsø, who is the artistic director of Carte Blanche, which is a smaller theatre or middle-scale theatre in Viborg, which is in the middle of Jutland. She has been running this theatre for how many years? 10 years now. And she is the theatre in Viborg. She's also a member of the Danish Arts Council, the branch for performing arts, and she has had a lot of different relationships with other kind of producing methods and other kind of collaborations, which we will hear a bit about today. And then we have invited Egil Bjørnsen. He's an associate professor at the Telemark University College, and he has researched a lot into this concept of how to create, what kind of cultural leadership this new form of co-creation implies. So welcome to you too, Ian. We will hear a bit more about his work later. The form of this conference will be that we start in here by hearing something from Sarah on the topic, and after that it will be about 20 minutes, and after that we will hear Egil say something about it, and then we will split up into groups. One group will stay here, Sarah's group, will stay in here, and it will be moderated by Allan Klee, who's sitting there. He's the artistic director of Københavns Musikteater here, and he's also been extensively involved in different kind of co-creation networks. And Egil and I and our group, we will cross the square and go to the building which you just left, and there we will discuss on that. And you're extremely free just to follow the group which you find the most interesting. After we've been together in those two groups, we'll meet in here afterwards again for a discussion about what we have been talking about in the two different groups. All right. Great. But I think we should just get started, and Sarah will start to present her thoughts on this subject with a concrete example of what she's just been doing with the library in Viborg.
With all these computers is just because I couldn't print my notes. As you said, my name is Sarah, and I'm situated in Viborg. 10 years ago, I was living and working here in Copenhagen when I was asked if I wanted to bring my theater to Viborg and work there as a region theater. One of the reasons I was asked, I think, is because I was and I am very curious and interested in cross-aesthetic and cross-institutional projects. And that was something that they were interested in developing between the different cultural institutions in the region. A lot of my curiosity in the work that I do has to do with how we can bring theatre, art and performance, whatever we like to call it, out of the theatre space and into other platforms that don't have an art product as the main goal. Like libraries, cultural museums, democratic investigations, city planning, all kinds of different cultural projects. I think there is a strong, and I think this is also what we hear these days, there is a stronger and stronger need for the art to re-enter the whole culture and not only to live in a side culture that we can visit when we need to be inspired or be entertained. And I find that the big question and the big danger is also how to bring the art out of the art frame in a way that is still on the terms of the art and not reduces arts to a tool for something else. And for me, what keeps making these kind of cultural mixes very interesting and co-productions interesting is that it's really impossible to say exactly where that difference is. So just to be a bit concrete, I'd like to talk from a project that I did with the library in Viborg. It's called All That Is Told and All We Know. It was founded both by the library and by the Arts Council. And it was both a project that had the goal to develop the identity of the library and the librarians by asking existential questions to the people working in the library and to the institution itself. And it also had the goal to then create and produce a performance that was a piece of art in itself. The whole project was followed by a lecture from the Southern Danish University, and she's the one who made this report, which I think is also linked on the website. The project ran over 1.5 months, the actual project, and I made the frame that I had invited 6 different artists that work in their own right, both with music and performance and poetry, And the artistic frame that we had to use the library as the scenography and the objects, and we were going to perform every evening when the library closed, and we had to use the transition of the closing of the library to be the beginning of the performance. Within this frame, they each had to make a solo that we then connected with the frame story. But they were free to work in whatever way they wanted, but they couldn't bring other things from outside, and they had to use the books and the library, because also the idea was that then we would have the scenography of this performance in every library in Denmark, because then we would know that this person had to do their performance in the section with food, and this person had to do their performance in the where the books by Kierkegaard were, and so on. So that was the idea. When we started, we had no idea what the content of the performance should be, because the whole idea was that through our meeting with the library and the librarians, we were going to develop the content. So we came completely, it was a bit scary, 3 hours or three weeks before the premiere, starting having absolutely no idea what we were going to do. So the first week, every day we had, I think, between 5 or 6 tours with a group of 2 performers and 3 or 4 librarians. Or not only the librarians, but actually everybody who worked in the library had a 1-hour meeting with us that was around the library. And we set it up as a bit of a game where we asked them a question and their answer would take us somewhere. So we would get a tour around the library that was kind of like a journey made of our questions and their answers. But our questions would be something that they would normally not be asked. For example, where is the best place to hide? And then they would take us there and explain why. And we would also ask them personal questions like, what's the very first book you remember ever reading? Or what's the book that made the biggest impression on you? And they would take us there. So in this way we had the chance to meet everybody in the library, and they had a chance to meet us. Plus we also used this hour to ask them what they felt was important about the library, and there's a whole idea and the myth of the library, and what is the library now, what was it before. And what it came down to, it was very moving actually, that there was the majority of everybody living in the working in the library had a very strong need to it's again this Danish word dannelse, to bring culture and education and existential growth into culture. It was not what their identity was in the daily life. It was very much about keeping things in order and making things work. But you felt that a lot of them actually bloomed by being asked these questions, because they came back to a more human core of why they were actually, or what the library could be. So after this week, each performer started to work, and they each created a scene that we then connected with the frame story. That was also inspired by the meeting we had with the librarians, because a lot of them talked about that what was important as a librarian was to ask the right question. So this became a performance about asking the right questions, and a library is a place where you can come and find questions you didn't know you had, instead of a place where you found answers. There was also a side project, which was one of the performers, Simon Nørgaard, which some of you might know. She's both a poet. She's made 2 publications, and she's also a performer and working with installation. And she made, also from his meeting with the librarians, she made this little book object that were part of it was one of the scenes in the performance that you can come and see, experience this book object, and you could also buy it and bring it home with you. I just want to show. So I find one of the things that is so interesting about these different different cultures meeting, and that is also being an artist moving to a small town and becoming a reading theatre, trying to stick on to your own artistic goal, but then meeting a culture that doesn't necessarily want you or ask you to come. How that meeting, what dialogue does that create? And also, we have with our work, we have a very national and international focus. We've toured a lot. We work a lot with international artists. So in this performance, there were 4 different nationalities. So we bring in artists from Europe, and there was also an Australian artist coming to work with us in a place like Viborg, and that also creates like an interesting mix of cultures and meetings. So this is just one example of one project that we made. There are some core principles that I would like to unpack a little bit, that I find are the ones that interest me the most. They're both the most challenging and also the most rewarding thing about these kind of cross-cultural meetings. First of all, I find the sharing and developing of knowledge through dialogue is the most important part. And dialogue for me is that you bring your own knowledge and experience to the table, but you're actually more curious about the knowledge and the experience of your partner. So it kind of changes the focus from what I want to do to what can you contribute with, and what happens when our knowledge and curiosity meet. And the outcome is always something that you couldn't foresee and control. And the process is at least as rewarding as the result. And it's always something more that you could have done yourself. So because I really like the dialogue form, and not so much the monologue, I've actually asked Jakob if you want to unpack some of these points with me that I find are essential. So I'll just come down to you. You have a microphone there that works?
Okay.
So I'll just, I have 3 points that I wrote down, and they kind of intertwine, and maybe they'll lead to something else. But what I wrote down as kind of core things, and this also for me goes when you work together with another artist, but they're kind of highlighted when your partner is an institution or person that doesn't have the art as their goal or their frame. And the first one is this thing of the meeting between different cultures, agendas, languages, or professions, because you have to question yourself, and you have to question how you express yourself and why you're doing things. And the other one is that there always is a non-negotiable frame that's put to you from the outside. And the third is that the question that, is the product necessarily art? So for me, these are the 3 main interests in these meetings.
Mm-hmm. And my first question would then be to repeat your last question: is this really art?
Yeah, I don't know. And I actually think, and I think we see this in these years, I think we see this in 1,000 different ways, that the art product is more and more difficult to define where it is and what it is. I think because it feels a bit dangerous to go out of the art frame, because then you don't have you meet all kinds of other needs, for example, to meet the needs of budgets, or what do you call it? This audience wants this kind of product, and so on. So how do you not miss the core of your own work? I think that's the point, more than what is the product, because I think the product can be many things if you just stay true, and that would be very different for whoever the artist or the collective is, the artist collective is, but that you stay true to the core or the motivation, and not go into a field where you feel this is not on your own terms.
Yes, because you could say that some people maybe think, okay, this is just a new way of presenting the library, but I mean, when you describe it, it sounds extremely interesting from an artistic point of view. But I would like to ask maybe, You made it sound very easy just to go into the library and do this work. But what are the main challenges? Because they have a totally different organizational structure, and they also have a different culture of how to work and also work with an audience. But what were the main challenges do you met in this cooperation?
I think it's also always, if you go into an institution that have another, they have another agenda, they have another closing hours. For example, one evening we discovered, and we had only 3 nights where we could rehearse actually before we had to show. And 1 or 2 of the evenings they had booked a talk with a writer, because they didn't imagine in their heads that you couldn't do 2 things in the same time. And also because the institution is so big that you don't have one thing going, you have many things going. So it takes a lot of patience to work in a different frame, because you can't expect that there is the same kind of room that you can demand when you go into a black box. Okay, you know, nobody will disturb you and you can stay here as long as you want. You have to adapt to the other culture. We worked a lot during the night, because in the day, of course, there were people in the library, so we worked in the night time, because that was the only time we could be there.
What kind of audience did you meet in this production, and what were they the same who go to the theatre, or was it the library visitors, and what happens to the concept of the audience when you do this kind of work?
Mainly it was the same audience that comes to our other performances, but this is one of the things that we more and more realize, that if we do something new, for example a library performance, we cannot assume, because we really wanted the people who uses the library to be our main audience, and that was what we had hoped. But we can see, and this is our ongoing experience, that we cannot just put a new thing out there and then expect that a new audience is coming. So there actually is a big artistic work with how you present it or how you get it out. And I know you have, because you brought one of our performances to your theatre and experienced the same problem, because it wasn't categorized children or adult theatre, and therefore it was difficult to get an audience there. So we can really see that we have to think the whole way that the performance meets the world or communicates to the audience. We have to think that in as part of the artistic work, actually, because it doesn't happen by itself.
So just to make it clear, maybe, what is the main difference between the audience role, between the if you had made the library show at the theatre in the black box instead of doing it in the library, what is the main difference between the spectators or the audience role in those 2 different?
I think it's actually more the other way around, that we heard a lot of feedback that people said when they came back to the library after we'd gone, the library changed for them. All of a sudden there were places in the library that they now knew in a different way. And the same with all the people working in the library, that they had a new relationship to the same building. Because actually what we do, because we work with darkness and so on, so we do turn the library into a set piece. It doesn't really matter if, I mean, it could be in the theatre, it is a theatrical experience. So the interesting thing is more, because we use the room differently, that memory stays in the room in a way, after we've gone.
And when then somebody comes to you, and some kind of other cultural institution than a theatre, comes to you and says, should we do a cooperation about this? It could be a museum, it could be a library, it could be anything. How do you approach it? How do you decide if this is the right way of exploring things for you? And what do you put up any conditions, or do you just try to go by intuition?
I can see now, looking back, that every time we made something that turned out to be interesting and rewarding, it was always initiated by, there was something on a very human level, it's the only way I can describe it, that clicked. So there was me in our institution, and then there was a person in the other institution where we had there is a human connection where we can feel, wow, there's really something here that we want to explore, and it's equally important for different reasons, but it's not us visiting your institution, coming in and doing our thing in your place, and it's not you asking us to do a job. We actually have something that we both want to explore from our different angles. And if you have that, then so much is possible, because both sides are willingly to fight for it. In my experience, we need a person in the institution that is ready to fight for the project, because there are so many obstacles all the time. And then you have to be very flexible in terms of your ideas of, I mean, all the conditions that you would normally say, but this is the minimal if we should work. You can't expect that. You have to be willing to go with whatever is possible.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, and I think that's good for now. Then we can continue the discussion with Sarah later. But now I'd like to ask Egil to make his presentation. And I don't know exactly why we have so many chairs. Maybe it's a symbol of the co-creators who are not present here. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. And I like it that it's an informal setting. I thought I was going to meet in a whole big auditorium, and I'm not that well prepared, so I'm kind of glad that it's sort of very informal and that we're going to discuss things afterwards. I am an academic because I work as a lector in Norway, but I've studied and I've written a PhD and stuff. But I also used to work in theatre and in the arts in more than marketing capacity 15 years ago, and I worked both in Norway and the UK. I lived in the UK for the last 15 years, so I know UK quite well, I know Norway quite well, and now I live in Denmark, so I'm getting acquainted to Denmark. And it's quite exciting actually to hear what's going on here, because the stuff that's going on in your region, and theatres like yours, I don't think we have anything quite like it in Norway. Nice to be back amongst artists, I should say. As an academic, you sometimes get a bit disconnected. But I was a little bit disappointed by the discussion this morning, that the discussion has moved on so little. I get a bit depressed about the debate on the use of arts versus entertainment as terms to describe what we're doing. I thought we were beyond that stage. You could say a bit about my own values and my sort of underlying ideas when I get into this. Is first, I am deeply skeptical about whether it's really possible to develop new audiences for the established professional arts. Audiences that are, demographically very different from the core audiences we have today. I base that both on my own experiences and also on sociological theory. When I entered the arts sphere, all the audience research and sociological theory that's sort of been come up for the last 50 years kind of gets forgotten because we get so evangelic about the arts and think that everything is possible. And also, another value, which I might not share with many of you, is that I actually don't think that the autonomy of the arts are under any great threat. The lament that was expressed by some of you before lunch is by no means new. You know, this sort of idea that the arts and artists are threatened by marketization, by instrumental cultural policy. Well, we heard it for 50 years. And I believe in the power of the arts, and I think that they can survive. They survived Thatcherism. You know, a lot of great theatre came out of Thatcherism. Actually, there's about 4 or 5 canonical playwrights that wouldn't hadn't been here if it wasn't for Thatcherism. So I'm not so skeptical. Anyway, over to my presentation. My presentation is based on the premise that contemporary theatre is of absolutely no relevance out there, neither within a critical public sphere or amongst most people, or folk flest, as we say in Norway. They only reach out to a bourgeois, narrow public, but more importantly, arts institutions hardly make any efforts to reach out any wider either. I shall primarily talk about Norway, which I know most, but I think that my conclusions and reflections are equally relevant in Denmark and the other Nordic countries. Now, okay, Norway is in a specific situation in that they haven't experienced these funding cuts as many other countries have over the last 10 years, or 5 to 10 years. It's quite the opposite. In Norway, there is actually more money has been pumped in year after year after year, which is unique globally, I think. Not something I think that maybe artists in Norway always acknowledge. My presentation, I'll start talking. Okay, I'm going to place this thing with this idea of co-creation in the context of audience development. And actually, I don't know that much about co-creation, but I know quite a bit about audience development. And I reflected quite a bit about how audience development challenges cultural leadership. And co-creation can be a way of audience development. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the critique of certain types of audience development projects before I finally say a bit about what an audience-centered approach, how that can affect cultural leadership. Without having researched this extensively, it's my observation that the quest and drive for co-creation and further audience and user involvement may be based on either a need to increase inclusion, to get more people involved, quite instrumental, or as a purely aesthetic strategy, or as may be the case in most circumstances, a combination of the two. I shall focus the discussion in this presentation on projects that aim to include a wider audience. Stressing, of course, that there is not necessarily any contradiction between the aim to include new audiences and to create work of aesthetically high quality. Of course not. In fact, I would argue that the quest for inclusion can act as an aesthetic catalyst. But everybody might not see it so, and we might perhaps discuss whether there is a dichotomy there later. But the common denominator in my talk is projects that aim to meet the quest for relevance, in that they meet the participants on their arena, on their home turf. In a cultural policy context, inclusion projects are, or the focus on inclusion, are based on the observation that the audience makeup, and we talked about that before lunch, of the professional arts are socially skewed. They're not only socially skewed, they're in fact extremely socially skewed, to the benefit of the well-to-do, highly educated middle classes, and it's kind of always been so. Ingrid before lunch mentioned some research in Norway that seems to question that, but if you look at sort of the statistics from Statistics Norway, which they do every second year, the same results come out again and again and again. Who makes use of the professional arts? That's the well-to-do middle classes with higher education. The policy response, in Norway at least, has been an increased focus on audience development and cultural inclusion. Let me talk a little bit more about audience development, which is a term that's being used a lot, both in the UK and now also in Scandinavia. In Norway we call it publikumsutvikling. It is a term around which there is little consensus, neither in a Norwegian or British context. We don't really know exactly what people talk about when they refer to audience development. And the main question is really whether audience development is a concern of artistic directors and artists, or just a task that can be delegated to a marketing or communication department. And this again relates to marketing theory. I need to talk a little bit about marketing theory. I'm sorry about it. or the scope and limitation of marketing and product development. Some of you might know this marketing guru that all business students read, and that's Philip Kotler. And he, maybe rudimentarily simplified, talks about marketing in that the marketeer, the person who markets, have 4 P's that they can use in their marketing toolbox. And they are price, promotion, place or distribution where the product is sold, and product. The last one is essential because for commercial ventures, product development is marketing. When the electric car manufacturer Tesla designs the new car, that is marketing, right? Creating a new fashion line of Nike runners, that is marketing. And when the cultural industries decides how to format their TV series or their film sequels or their computer games, that is marketing decisions, where the product is core. And marketing theory stipulates that marketing is an activity that is set out to satisfy a consumer demand, or indeed maybe create a consumer demand. And this is done through the product. For arts organizations, we can, in marketing terms, divide the product even further and distinguish between product surround and core product. Where product surround is everything that is central to the experience of coming to the theatre, which is not related to the core product. So the ambience of the venue, the bar, the wardrobe facilities, this could even extend to include the organization's brand, for which the core product, of course, also contributes. An example is, I don't know if you know about the new Opera House in Oslo. Some of you might have been there. It's a single, flagship building. And the Opera House talks a lot about how many people who are up on the roof, walking on the roof, because the roof is very inclusive, okay? So a lot of people have used the Opera House by walking on the roof, or skating on the roof, or sunbathing on the roof, or drinking beer on the roof. It's very important to emphasize that the roof of the Opera House is product surround. It's not the core product. But what about the core product? My postulate is that the core product equals, in the theatre, equals artistic decisions. So it is artists or artistic directors who make decisions about the core product. So where we have marketing strategies and education strategies and audience development strategies and strategies for children and young people, sometimes they're core product and sometimes they're tagged on. It depends on the kind of theatre, I suppose. Front of house strategies, press and PR strategies, and what have you, they are decisions that are made by the whole organization, and they can use the whole tool, almost the whole Kotler toolbox. They can talk about use price, they can use promotion, they can use place and products around, but they cannot touch the core product. So if you're a marketing director, a communication director, or an education director, or whatever, you cannot touch the core product. That's my postulate. You might not agree with that. The core product is left to the realm of the artistic directorship. And many of us would agree that that's the way it should be. Okay? I go to see a performance at the Congelia because I want to be thrilled, and I am keen for the artistic director there to make decisions for me. Or should it be like that? We've had quite a loud debate in Norway about whether the autonomy of artists are being threatened. Most lately this has materialized through a critique of the apparent instrumentalization of the institution's funding agreement. This cry appears at regular intervals, and I think it's part of a discursive strategy from artistic directors with low self-confidence. There is at least little research that supports the idea that the autonomy of the artists are being threatened, at least in Norway. Marketization, yes, we're living in a marketized world. New public management, I'm not even sure what new public management is in Norway. I think it is that you have to report how many tickets you sold. If that's new public management, if I look to the UK, what they have to do there. But, yeah, exactly. I would like, when I hear calls about new public management, I like to see facts and research, not just discourse. And I'm not so sure whether it's as grim that some people present it as. Anyway, according to a cultural policy scholar called Nobuko Kawashimo, she splits audience development into two types. And she asks, is audience development the same as arts marketing, where you can use the 3.5 P's, price, promotion, place, and product surround, and the marketing department is tagged on. Ingrid talked a little bit about it before lunch, that you have to communicate differently to different segments and so on and so forth. That's arts marketing. Okay, we communicate differently to young people as we do to people with a master's degree and so on and so forth. And the objective is to reach new audience segments, but not all new audience segments that are significantly different from those we already have. Or is audience development what Kawashima calls target-led audience development, where you use a strategic use of the artistic product to facilitate cultural inclusion? Let me explain a little bit more. Product-led audience development. The product already exists. There's an existing arts production, and the objective is a larger audience, but not necessarily bigger than the one you have. Whereas and this is how the professional arts have been mediated over the last 60 years. Of course, increasingly sophisticated marketing tools. Now we have social media, now we have mobile apps, now we have what have you. Not necessarily always done very professionally, but at least we have a lot of tools. But the principle that the product is there and the marketing comes on afterwards is, or the audience development, if you like, comes afterwards, is tried and tested. Target-led audience development, on the other hand, takes the needs and the wishes of the needs and the wishes of the excluded audiences as a starting point. And the objective is cultural inclusion, and it requires a large degree of dialogue. You will go out to those excluded audiences and try and find out, what do you want, what do you need, what kind of stories do you want to have told, and then you might create a project afterwards. And this is where kind of maybe co-creation projects come in that so far I'm trying to contextualize where co-creation projects can fit in. And a project where you go out and actually ask excluded groups to come in and co-produce something with you. And I think that Kawashima's suggestion is correct, because none of the efforts to democratize the arts using the product-led approach has really worked. We've been, working on it for 60 years, but it's the same exclusion mechanisms amongst audiences exist today. The Norwegian culture policy scholar Per Mangset, a colleague of mine, he concluded, after having analysed pretty much all there is of audience statistics available in Norway over the last 50 years, that is true. Everybody consumes more culture now than they did 50 years ago, and it sort of moved up a bit, but the differences still are the same. Okay, and it's very much divided according to level of education, class. Could it then be that it's actually the arts institutions themselves that acts as the main obstacle? That the arts institutions themselves are in the way? You cannot facilitate audience development when you are in this bloody institution. And some critics have reflected over this. A guy called Christian Meisingset, who's part of a sort of centre-right think tank in Norway, he says that the largest obstacle for opera attendance is the opera culture itself. Or Anne-Britt Grahl from BI, the business school in Oslo, many people cannot or will not partake in the ritualized Western art sphere. I'm asking myself, I think that this is very wise words. I'm asking myself, what are they talking about? Do they talk about product surround or core product? Do they talk about, when Meisingset talks about opera culture, does he refer to operas themselves or the whole ritual with everything around? All the things that makes the Norwegian opera and ballet being a very poor brand affinity for so many people. Those who believe that the arts can be democratized and made accessible for all will probably argue that it is the product surround that acts as the obstacle. The bourgeois context, the champagne bar, the white wine, and the way that you should behave, and where you applaud when you listen to symphonic music, for example. And if you only can demystify the whole experience, more people will come. Others will argue that in order to develop a taste for opera, for example, certain codes and skills must be acquired, and you can maybe learn them at school, or you can learn them in your family, but if you haven't learned them by the age of 20, forget it. Before I continue, I should stress that many co-creation projects do stem from, as I mentioned in my introduction, a desire to innovate aesthetically. I think your project is an example of that. And the audience development dimension might only be a byproduct. But however, it does often relate to relevance, for the institutions to try to be of more relevance. Like when the Art Gallery of Ontario launched its Audience as Artists program called In Your Face, which was basically asking audiences from all around the world to send in their self-portrait, and that became the exhibition. And that's not maybe that innovative. I've heard about different similar projects elsewhere. But how the gallery themselves reflected on that process is interesting. They say the exhibition helped to pull the gallery away from its modus operandi, where curatorial experience is paramount, towards a model where the visitor experience is paramount. And that is maybe an example of a co-creation project of which is target-led, possibly. So this indicates that the audience experience may, in some projects, be as important, if not more, as the aesthetic qualities that is played out. So although I'm in the danger of repeating myself again and again here, I'm stressing that I'm preoccupied with co-creation projects where audience experiences and relevance are paramount. Before I move on to say a bit more about how we're doing on time?
4 minutes?
Yeah, that should be right. Before I move on to say a bit more about what kind of leadership challenges such an approach implies, let's have a look at the critique against target-led audience development. A couple of years ago, Audiences Norway invited Tiffany Jenkins from a right-leaning British think tank called Institute of Ideas to comment on Norwegian inclusion projects, which she discarded as, I don't know, I can't translate this, stupefied audience flirtation. And it's actually undermining the arts, it's not what the arts is supposed to do, she said. Perhaps a more robust challenge has been levelled by Munira Mirza, who also has been affiliated with the Institute of Ideas and published a book last year entitled In Defense of Universalism. She is deeply worried about how recent changes in culture policy is challenging a universal valuation of culture. And a universal valuation of culture has been the key cultural policy principle of the last 60 years. And it is the foundation of what we call the objective to democratize the arts. It implies faith in cultural authority, that somebody is given cultural authority. It is based on clear cultural hierarchies, and it's based on expert-led, peer-reviewed quality judgments, and attached to that the arm's length principle. Mirza juxtaposes such a universal valuation based on what she called objective criteria of judgment to audience development projects based merely on the arbitrary taste of individuals. It's an interesting observation that these kind of critiques come from the right of the political spectrum, I think. And it is true that target-led audience development initiatives are not entirely driven by artistic visions, whether they have an element of co-creation attached to it or not. Typically, they are maybe rooted in people's lives, as opposed to some sort of canonized legitimation. My colleague from Aarhus, Louise Seigod Hansen, she warns also against what could be the ultimate consequence of target-led audience development. And she says, in its most radical form, audience development implies that the evaluation of a cultural experience is left completely to the users, and that there exists no privileged evaluation position for neither critics, performing artists, nor cultural policymakers. And consequently, artistic quality is completely removed as a cultural policy objective. So these are sort of critics and skeptical views on inclusion and target-led audience development projects. It may not be clear now. It might be clear now that target-led audience development projects breaks with the traditional ideas of cultural authority and cultural leadership. It breaks, for example, entirely with this postulate, which was presented by the director of the Bergen International Festival and who's now director of the Norwegian National Opera, Per Boye Hansen, when he says, our starting point is that we have been given as our task to present art of the highest excellence and then to share it with as many as possible, but in that order. It's very important in that order. So this is a traditional cultural leadership. I'm going to skip the next slide. Okay. So the question is, target-led audience development is about, and this is maybe questions we can discuss afterwards. Target-led audience development is about identifying the needs of the target audience, and it would most probably contain an element of co-creation, I think. You could argue that it's demand-led, and it calls for a new cultural leadership, one which perhaps defines artistic or maybe excellence in new and different ways. The question is, are the arts and are the theatre world prepared, and should they? And also, in extension, does it threaten the theatre's autonomy, and does it threaten its universal value? And of course, finally, does it make the theatre relevant for more people? Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Egil. Okay, now we will split up in two groups, and the people who would like to join Egil and me, we will go over there, the other side of the square, and Sarah and Ellen will stay here with the rest of the group, and we will meet here again. 20 minutes past 2 to have a discussion together.